Hello, how are you guys? In today's video, we'll be discussing how to write survey questions based on your framework. And this is very important. And this is a major step towards data collection, which will help us measure the variables, test the hypothesis, find relationships, and answer basically our research questions. Ideally, step one is always to look back at our research framework. If you remember, we've discussed this in a previous video. The research framework defines what variables are we going to test, what relationships, hence hypotheses, are we going to test in the context of our research problem. So your research framework, just a quick reminder, would look at your research objectives. What do you want to find out? Your hypothesis, what relationships or differences are you testing? Your variables, what factors are being measured in terms, again, part of these hypotheses. So that's what our framework is. So once we do that, we need to identify our key variables to be measured. When you talk about variables, usually we classify them as three things. It's either an independent variable. These are the factors that you manipulate or categorize. Basically, you can change. We call them independent variables. They don't depend on anything. Then we have the dependent variables, which is usually the output we're looking at, the factor that you're measuring or expecting to change. So a factor that's might change based on other factors. So this is what we refer to as dependent variable compared to the independent variables. And then you have the control variables. These are other factors that might influence the results, and we need to actually account for them. Usually we talk about age, demographics, education. These are typical examples for control variables. So one more time, three different kind of variables you need to identify from the framework and the hypothesis that you actually have developed based on the literature review, based on your research problem. Independent, dependent, or control variables. Let me give you an example. Suppose, again, one of the projects of some students in class, war-affected regions experience higher rates of PTSD, again, post-traumatic stress disorder, due to prolonged exposure to conflict. Interesting. So we're saying, this is a hypothesis they're trying to test, war-affected regions experience, and a region where there's a lot of war, experience a higher rate of PTSD due to exposure to conflict. Based on this, let's identify the variables, and then we could even put the question. So, and based on this, the independent variable is exposure to war. It's independent. You're either affected or not affected. You're in a region that's affected by war or not affected. You can see how we categorize it into groups. Again, the independent variable. And obviously, to ask a question on this would be easy. Are you in a region affected by war? You could categorize it simply by asking a question. That's the independent variable. Now, the dependent variable in this example I'm giving you is obviously PTSD level. It's depending on whether or not you are in a region that has conflict. Hence, it's a dependent variable. Again, usually you measure it using a Likert scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or some scale that's available and validated, and that's most likely the case. So scales that you will find in any research that have been published before are usually validated. So for example, if I want to measure emotion, I cannot ask somebody, what is your emotion level or anxiety? Usually you would refer to a published validated scale we can use to measure and quantify that variable, which will help us to actually answer and test the hypothesis. So scales are good for measuring or used for measuring, and usually validated scales you could find depending on the variables. Sometimes it's as simple as a Likert scale, 1 to 5, or it could be a validated scale published, again, motivation, for example. How do you measure motivation? You need a validated scale. I've worked a lot on this in terms of education. Anxiety, emotions, resilience. All these are things that are usually based on validated published scales. Okay, and again, in our example, the control variables will be age, gender, status, economic status, and so on. So this is a small example that kind of took a hypothesis and identified the variables. So now let's take the variables that we identified and then design clear, measurable survey questions. So that's the whole point. So we have the variables now, we want to measure them. As I said, you might use a validated scale for this and therefore ask the questions based on the validated scales. So let's start with the independent variables. Independent variables, usually, as you saw, we categorize them into groups. Again, most likely multiple choice categories. Back to our question, it could be, which of the following best describes your current place of residence? A region experiencing armed conflict or war. A region not experiencing war now, a region that experienced war in the past, for example. So you can see we group them into clusters. This is usually how we would do for most independent variables. Now, for dependent variables, most likely it's based on a validated scale, as I said, or maybe as simple as a Likert scale. For example, in our case, would be, again, I'm going to make it simple, but usually you will use a validated scale. For the PTSD symptoms in the past month, how often have you experienced nightmares related to conflict? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, very often, for example. So you have this kind of 1 to 5, to be honest. Are you experiencing nightmares? Again, doesn't mean that nightmares means PTSD. Maybe it's one of the variables. Therefore, you need to refer to a scale to measure it. Okay? Look at control variables. Of course, it's very easy, like age, gender. What's your age? What's your gender? These are usually as simple as multiple choice or ranges that you will answer to measure them. So we have the control variables, kind of straightforward, the dependent and the independent variables. So once you look at that, we need to go back to the hypothesis and say, now we have these variables, we're measuring them. We have to keep in mind what our hypothesis is. Because if my hypothesis is to find the average or compare averages or maybe finding relationship like a correlation analysis, we need to keep in mind that we need to measure two variables, quantify them, and then do the test on them. So for example, how does exposure to war influence your mental health? Exposure, mental health. So one, I need to ask, this is maybe a correlational study. This is correlation, a relationship between two, okay? Have you lived in a war-affected region, yes or no? How often do you experience stress, anxiety, 1 to 5? So I asked these two questions. You can see now I have these two variables. Hence, I could do the correlational analysis. Hence, my hypothesis in this case was testing a relationship. So I ask one, put them next to each other, the same person answering, and then 1,000 other people answering the same two questions. Now I can do a correlational study. So this is kind of interesting. So this is how we do a correlation analysis. It could be maybe an ANOVA test or a t-test where we look at variances or averages. I'll have another video on talking about different kind of analysis. Same thing, you need to put the hypothesis in mind and make sure you're measuring the variables that you need for the hypothesis. So in this case, for example, another project, I'm picking some of the projects, I put them down, of the students. So do university students have higher awareness of PCOS compared to high school students? Oh, in this case, I'm comparing university versus high school, hence an ANOVA test, hence a t-test, when you compare averages or you compare variances between different groups. So in this case, I need to ask about what's your level of education? Are you in high school? Are you in uni? And then, have you heard of PCOS before? Rate your knowledge about PCOS, for example, from 1 being low, 5 being high. Based on these two now, I could do an ANOVA or a t-test, because now I have the information I need. And in this case, in case you don't know what the t-test is, again, watch another video for this, or ANOVA. So where I compare means of different clusters, In this case, it's university versus school. Their average of a specific score. In this case, awareness, okay? Again, we could do also, let's say, chi-square test. I'll talk about it later on in another video, but suppose I'm testing frequencies. Is there a difference in OTC medication, over-the-counter medication, misuse between different income levels? So now I'm looking at different income levels, and I want to look at, is there a difference between OTC medication misuse? So in this case, we're testing frequencies, hence a chi-square test will be ideal. Again, don't worry about what kind of tests. Again, these are only terminologies I'm putting in this video just for you to refer to another video to know more about them. The focus now is the survey question itself. Difference in OTC medication between different income levels. So I'm going to ask about the monthly income level, less than 5,000 or 500, between 500,000 and so on. And then how often do you take OTC medications without a doctor's prescription? Likert scale 1 to 5. You could see the dependent variable versus the independent variable. Again, we could have also control variables. So if I ask these two questions, I'm able to do this test. So ideally, again, I give some examples here based on real student projects, just to show you how we need to think about survey questions when we do them. We need to make sure once we do them, there's no way back. Meaning I need to make sure the data is enough to test the hypothesis. Therefore, I need to put the hypothesis in front of me, the variables, the scales, the framework. All these combined will inspire how I'm going to actually collect the data. Just to finish this video, when you write survey questions, make sure you keep your questions clear and concise. Avoid jargon, technical terms, acronyms. Avoid them. 2, use neutral wording. Very important. Avoid leading them. Avoid being biased. Very important. You don't want to lead them towards what you want. 3, ensure answer choices are mutually exclusive and exhaustive. Meaning there's no intersection between the answers. Also, they're exhaustive, meaning you put all the options out there. And finally, make sure to pilot test your survey. Get feedback, answer some of it by some people around you, your group. Let them answer it. See, something wasn't clear. We change it. Get the data. Do a test on this. And this is very important. And that's my number 5. Is do not wait to collect the data in order for you to do the analysis. You say, how? Very good point. Because we need data to do the analysis. We fake it first. We create fake data as if they answered it. We copy paste it. We auto-generate it. We automate it. So we get 1,000 responses that are not real. We're only going to use them in order to test our analysis and methodology plan. So in other words, I'm going to assume these are the data. We're going to start doing the hypothesis testing. We're going to do everything. And then later on, when we collect the data, it will be basically plug and play. Remove my fake data, put the real data. This will allow us to expedite our research because most likely your survey questions and your whole project would require ethical clearance from the IRB, the research board. And usually that process will take time, weeks, sometimes months, depending on the scale of the project. Therefore, we want to generate the survey questions based on what I discussed in this video, submit for ethical clearance, and don't wait. Continue doing your research, but don't go data collection until you get your ethical clearance. However, we could always continue working on it with non-real data and then test all our analysis, ANOVA, chi-square, regression analysis, SEM, correlational. All these, we could talk about them in a different video. I hope you enjoyed this. See you in the next video. Take care.